Marvel: The Tragedy That No One Knows. The most successful film series. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is the most successful film franchise in history. You can argue that, but it's not true. That's a big statement. Endgame became the highest-grossing film of all time. Black Panther received a Best Picture nomination. They appear to be popular among critics. They are well-liked by the public. It's strange to say that Marvel has struggled a lot throughout their history. I'm sure you didn't expect that. They've been one of the most well-known names in comics, creating some of the most recognizable characters. Some of the most popular superhero films featured their characters. Nonetheless, they have seen some significant ups and downs. They even declared bankruptcy in 1996. I'd like to discuss that, as well as some significant changes over the years. Going all the way back to the start. Before Marvel, comic books were becoming increasingly popular in the late 1930s. Action Comics #1 was published in 1938, introducing the world to Superman for the first time. Of course, it was a huge financial success, and it prompted many people to consider comic books as a viable business. Pulp magazines used this low-quality paper to print fictional stories. Returning to comics was a big deal at the time. Marvel famously featured the Human Torch and the Submariner, both of whom went on to become superheroes. Marvel's flagship characters. That first comic was such a success that Goodman decided to start a new comics company called Timely Productions. In the early 1950s, the company was known as Timely Productions before being renamed Atlas Publishing. The first issue of Captain America was published in March 1941. Their success can be explained by getting into a growing industry and having cool characters. They were capitalizing on World War II, and this cover is one of the most iconic images from that era. The incredible part is that this was published months before the United States even entered the war. This more serious topical content began to attract an older audience. They were being read by military personnel. It's clear that the war aided the growth of this company and comic books in general. The sales went down. On the negative side, by 1945, the war had ended, which was bad news for the comic book industry, particularly the superheroes, because they were no longer as relevant and people weren't responding to them in the same way, and as a result, sales dropped at Timely Productions. For a time in 1950, they abandoned their three flagship heroes in favor of other types of publications. I'm talking about romance, science fiction, cowboys, horror, and other genres aimed at men, women, and children. By the 1950s, they had recovered dozens of different series from when they were old. They were successful in attracting and retaining an audience's attention. However, it did not last long, as 1954 marked the beginning of their next major fall. It was the Comics Code Authority this time. In short, parents were extremely critical of comic books. They claimed to have been creating, you know how it goes, warping the minds of America's youth or whatever. The problem was that those parental groups wielded some power as well. Comic books were not sold in specialty stores at the time. Some of these comics were excessive at the time, but they were simply going overboard. There were public comic book burnings. It made it all the way to Congress. The comic book industry formed the Comics Code Authority to prevent the government from passing censorship legislation. It changed the language, how crimes were depicted, how people were drawn, and overall, it changed the comics. So much blander and more monotonous. Many people read them because of their edgy content. As if every movie suddenly had to be graded, which would be bad for the industry, these stamps persisted. The criteria were relaxed, but Marvel continued to use them in some of their comics until 2001. Stan Lee the Savior. Stan Lee was the reason for the retort. Other people and factors were involved, but Stan Lee was at the center of it all. He had been with Marvel almost from the beginning, having been hired as a teenager in their first year of operation and quickly promoted to editor. They would argue that they had internal struggles and were therefore more relatable. You know, over the next few years, he'd introduce a slew of others who met those requirements. Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and X-Men appear later. This is when the Marvel comes into play. Beginning to form, the comics were eventually branded under the Marvel name. Stan Lee miraculously found a way to retract the readers while adhering to the strict set of codes. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, their business experienced some minor fluctuations. Everything appeared to be better than ever in the early 1990s. Sales were at an all-time high, but some of those figures may have been deceptive. For many people in the 1980s and early 1990s, comic books became more about collecting than reading. Books about comics. Stores sprouted up all over the place, and certain comics were selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Collectibles can be dangerous because their value is frequently exaggerated. Once everyone realizes this, the bubble bursts and the comic become worthless. Sales decrease dramatically as people realize they wasted their money buying copies of a comic that they don't even care about. However, because their sales fell, they were unable to make their payments and filed for bankruptcy. They were working on expanding into trading cards in the early 1990s. Perhaps if they had invested in something else, they could have used those sales to power through, but you could see how these decisions only made things worse. Following the company's bankruptcy in 1998, Toy Biz became the new owners and changed their name to Marvel. Surprisingly, Toy Biz was one of the companies acquired by Marvel prior to the bankruptcy. Bankruptcy. The company owes $610 million and intend to declare bankruptcy for the next 7 years. Marvel laid off 1/3 of its workforce. Shares that were worth $35.75 in 1993 are now worth $2.38. Marvel Comics was founded by Ronald Perlman, who purchased the company for $82.5 million in 1989. Perlman had a long history of turning around failing brands for a profit. As a result, there was a speculator boom in the same way that any speculator boom occurs. So, people would buy 10 copies of a comic book and keep 9 of them in the hope that they would be worth millions of dollars someday. Profits increased tenfold in just 2 years. Variation was printed by comic book retailers at all levels, and so you'd get a comic with the same story on the inside but a different cover or a slight variation in presentation. The rise in future value was making it increasingly unlikely that profits would be doubled. Marvel has decided to create more memorials. However, the industry was contracting, and Marvel was in trouble. By 1995, Perlman and Marvel had been caught up in the pursuit of profits. The company reported a $48 million loss and a $581 million debt. Marvel Studios was founded by Jack Perlman as a joint venture between Marvel and action figure company Toy Biz. However, shareholders vetoed the plan, claiming that the financial impact on the stock would be too great. Perlman declared bankruptcy to carry out his plan without shareholder approval. Mr. Perlman's ties to the company were severed after a 2-year court battle, and Marvel was now owned by 2 toy industry executives. They, like Perlman, had a direct target movie. They knew this was the future, but Marvel, fresh out of bankruptcy, needed quick cash, so they auctioned off their characters' cinematic rights to Hollywood. The issue was that Hollywood executives did not see the value, and Marvel was forced to accept unfavorable terms. They were sitting in a gold mine. Marvel films from the late 1990s and early 2000s were box office smashes. Blade grossed $70 million at the box office, but Marvel reportedly only made $25,000. The first 2 Spider-Man films grossed $3 billion. However, Marvel only received 62 million viewers in total. They were sitting on a gold mine but couldn't profit from it. Marvel was preparing to sell Captain America to Warner Brothers and Thor to Sony in 2003. But it took until 2005 for a deal to be reached. Merrill Lynch contributed $525 million over 7 years, allowing Marvel to make any superhero film they desired, with one major caveat. The collateral consisted of the film rights to 10 main characters. Marvel Studios' first order of business was to assemble previously sold characters. They were successful in regaining the rights to characters such as Black Widow, the Hulk, and, of course, Iron Man. Following that, Marvel Studios appointed self-proclaimed comic book nut Kevin Feige as president. A man who is devoted to Marvel. The rest is history. Iron Man was released in theaters on May 2, 2008. Marvel's future was at stake. In the first weekend, it was an instant blockbuster hit. The film grossed nearly $100 million in total, while the first film grossed $585 million. It was such a huge success that Disney paid $4.3 billion for Marvel in 2009. Everything else is history. Marvel films have grossed over $14 billion worldwide. This represents roughly 13% of total box office since 2008. Disney's shareholders approved the acquisition of 21st Century Fox's film and television studios in July of 2018. Fox previously owned the rights to X-Men Fantastic Four and Deadpool. I believe we can say that the transition into films and Disney's involvement. Let me know in the comments, what do you think of all these changes? Personally, I think it's great to see a company that has been through so much. In 1996, they finally achieved this level of success. It appeared that was the end of it, but they worked their way back. It's a fantastic comeback story. Also, what is your favorite Marvel movie, and do you have any other thoughts about Marvel? Please leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you for your time.